I was at a dinner party last week. It was loud, everyone was laughing, glasses were clinking. Then, as it always does, the conversation turned. A man at the end of the table, someone who speaks in very loud headlines, suddenly fixed his gaze on another guest. "It's a simple question," he said, cutting through the noise. "Are you for it or are you against it? It's one or the other." The entire table just stopped. The clatter of forks disappeared. Everyone stared at this one person, waiting for them to pick a box, to plant their flag. And the guest, she just paused. She didn't rush to answer. She didn't look angry or scared. She just took a slow sip of her wine, holding that pocket of silence while the man stared her down. In that moment, she wasn't for, she wasn't against. She was in that tiny electric space between the two. And it struck me that we're obsessed with the destinations, the answers, the labels, but we've forgotten that our entire lives are actually lived right there in that pause, in the threshold. Okay, so let's unpack this. The mission for this deep dive is really to explore that exact space, that vital threshold between the binary poles.
We're looking at what the French call the entre deux, right? The space between two.
Yeah.
And crucially, this isn't about being indecisive. It's presented as an active, intelligent zone. We've got some fascinating material showing how living in this, ambiguous zone is actually key to our mental health. And it's critical for modern leadership, too, and even essential for deeper learning.
Yeah, it's really striking, isn't it, how this idea, this resistance to just slapping a label on something immediately or rushing to a conclusion, how it's surfacing across different fields. You see it in psychology, in organizational behavior, pedagogy. It's popping up all over. And if you connect that to the bigger picture, it kind of suggests that maybe our human operating systems, maybe they're not really optimized for the answer itself. Maybe they're optimized for the fluid process of existing in that unanswered space. We're going to show you exactly how embracing that uncomfortable middle ground can actually build resilience and drive high performance. But it means we have to confront some pretty deeply ingrained cultural biases that just prize certainty above everything else.
Yes. So if we refuse the easy for or against, what exactly are we embracing? Because when you first hear entre deux, it sounds like nothing, like a void maybe, but the thinking here is that it's actually an active, vibrant, almost foundational space.
That's precisely the core philosophical idea, that life actually prefers these thresholds, these pauses, not the destinations, not the certainties we chase. We are culturally obsessed with seeking conclusions, aren't we? Deciding things, closing the deal, putting a neat little stamp on it so we can file it away. But the moment of real vitality, the aliveness, happens in that trembling interval, The moment before the decision is spoken, or the instant before a kiss, or that hesitation just before the right word comes out. That's where possibility still lives. As one philosopher puts it, we are most at the world, most fully engaged right in that instant where everything could still turn, could still go either way.
Okay, so philosophically speaking, this space between the poles, it's not empty. It's not just a gap in the line.
Absolutely not. It's described as matter active, or like a paste maybe, a milieu.
Yeah.
It's rich, dynamic stuff. Think of it like dough fermenting. It's working, it's alive, but it hasn't become bread yet, right? And that active, undefined state is where the real exchange happens, which leads us straight into this concept of reversibility.
Reversibility. Okay, that sounds a bit dense. Can you unpack that for us a little?
Sure. Think about the phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He had this idea of the flesh of the world. The key insight, basically, is that touching and being touched, they're a single reciprocal exchange. It's not like A touches B and then B feels A's touch as a separate event. When you say, pass your hand over a cat's muzzle, the cat is simultaneously passing itself over the palm of your hand. It goes both ways at once. The roles are reversible. The boundary between the two poles, the one doing the sensing and the one being sensed, it kind of dissolves in the exchange itself. And the entre deux works like that. It's this constant movement that never really stops long enough to be pinned down, to be categorized or logged on some simple identity sheet. It's pure relation.
Huh. But the moment we try to talk about this relationship, society just forces us back into simple labels, right? Which immediately works against that fluidity you're describing. We're constantly pushed into the binary. Is it good? Is it bad? For or against, gentle or cruel, sane or crazy.
And that's exactly why embracing the entre deux becomes an ethical act as much as a psychological one. It's not indecision. It's described as the honest frequenting of complexity. And that takes enormous time, enormous patience, which naturally frustrates what one writer calls the merchants of speed.
Merchants of speed, I like that.
Yeah, those political, social, commercial interests. They profit from quick fixes, fast answers, polarized certainty. Complexity just slows things down, and speed absolutely detests nuance.
We see this play out all the time in daily life, don't we? If someone asks you to define yourself quickly, you just default to the easiest labels. But those labels, they almost never capture the actual reality of being human.
Precisely. Refusing the binary allows for contradictions to be the engine, not some kind of parasitic weakness. The philosophical position here is that being able to hold opposing truths simultaneously, like being utterly exhausted and intensely in love, or, being generous towards one person while feeling deeply jealous of someone else's success, that's where genuine truth resides. To claim you are only one thing is basically a lie of simplification. The entre deux acknowledges you're both, or many things at once, and therefore you're actually being more true.
And this connects to something called politics of decency. How does simply existing in that middle space translate into better ethics or better politics?
Well, it translates directly because it prevents the laziness of slogans. A slogan works precisely by eliminating the middle ground, right? It forces immediate emotional alignment and basically shuts down critical thinking. But if you maintain the entre deux, you maintain your critical distance. You keep thinking. So this politics of decency is really the commitment to articulating complexity, even when it makes other people uncomfortable. Like in a complex policy debate, refusing to boil it down to a neat pro or con argument. Instead, patiently detailing all the interlocking factors. That stops us from resorting to cruelty or just, oversimplification to get a quick win. It's the courage to stand in the mess, like that guest at the dinner party who refused to give the easy, comfortable answer.
That courage. The courage not to lie just to provide comfort or a quick answer. That seems like the perfect bridge between the philosophy and the psychology side of things. If we know this space is so vital, why is it so psychologically draining, so hard to actually stay there?
Because staying there means sitting in the very real, very visceral experience of disequilibrium, of things not quite adding up yet. We seem to be wired, to seek patterns to find certainty, feel safer. So when those patterns dissolve or when certainty isn't available, we experience anxiety. It's almost automatic, the philosophical ideal of the entre deux. It requires psychological machinery. It requires that courage you mentioned, the courage to tolerate that anxiety without immediately running for the exits.
Okay, let's pivot now and look squarely at the mind. We heard this really moving story about a person grappling with grief. She described this period after her husband, Mark, died. For the first few months, she was clearly Mark's widow. A painful identity, yes, but a clear one. Years later, she started dating again, eventually maybe saw herself as fully single. But she said the absolute most painful, the hardest phase was that middle ground, that identity that was neither Mark's wife nor fully single, that liminal space, she called it. It felt undefined, kind of blank. And she often felt like that lack of a clear label meant she was failing somehow, failing to move on. But the argument here is that this state isn't a failure at all. It's actually a therapeutic necessity.
Yeah, and this brings us right to a core psychological concept, ambiguity tolerance, or AT for short. We basically define AT as the psychological capacity to, exist in situations that lack clarity, or situations that are novel or complex. And crucially, to do so without rushing to premature closure, without feeling extreme anxiety, or without engaging in avoidance behaviors, like just shutting down or distracting yourself. It's the ability to sit with that frisson, that little shiver of the unanswered question, without collapsing into panic or needing to fix it immediately.
That difference between just waiting for an answer and actively receiving the confusing information without shutting down, that seems really critical.
It is, and AT is such a powerful concept because it's highly operationalizable in clinical settings. You can actually measure it, work with it. Research shows it links directly to affective psychology, our emotions, personality studies, and even, interestingly, organizational psychology. It shows up as a measurable component of human resilience across different areas. So how does this actually show up in therapy? For someone listening, why should they care about their therapist's AT, or maybe even their own?
Well, critically, research shows that AT is deeply related to the quality of the therapeutic alliance, the relationship between the therapist and the client. Psychotherapy, especially the kind of integration therapy that draws from different approaches, is inherently messy, right? It's a process of uncovering underlying conflicts, testing out new ways of relating to the world. It's not linear. Now, if the person in therapy, or frankly, the therapists themselves, can't tolerate that messiness, that lack of immediate answers, the whole therapeutic process can get cut short prematurely. It just stalls. A patient who's higher in AT is more likely to stay engaged, even through difficult open-ended explorations. This makes the relationship with the therapist stronger, more effective. And this holds true across various successful therapy approaches. Healing, particularly from complex emotional states or deep trauma, it's really a process of approximation. It's not a straight line to some neat, clean outcome. That really highlights the importance of navigating those liminal states in healing, doesn't it? That transition phase, not yet phase, like the widow's experience. It's so often treated like a hurdle, something to just get over as fast as possible, almost like a failure state if you linger there too long.
Yes. And the shift in perspective here is absolutely crucial. We need to stop treating that liminal space as like a bug in the system. We need to see it as a necessary state of being in itself. Think about it biologically. Someone who's convalescing, right, recovering from an illness, they're no longer acutely sick, but they're certainly not yet recovered to their full strength. They might want to run a marathon mentally, but their body, their breath, their muscles, they just disagree. The body in that state is like a diplomat. It's signing truces, negotiating with the internal weather of recovery. The entre deux is its ministry, you could say. And that state requires, and that actually teaches, a kind of non-resigned patience.
Non-resigned patience. I really like that phrasing. So you're not abandoning the goal of recovery, but you're actively accompanying the process. You're accepting the internal resistance, the slowness, without fighting it constantly.
Exactly. And that acceptance in the face of ambiguity actually allows for better, deeper healing than any rigid formula could. When individuals who are navigating these big identity transitions, like the widow becoming single again, or someone changing careers, or dealing with loss when they're encouraged to treat the in-between as a legitimate place to reside for a while, they stop wasting so much energy fighting the transition itself. They start to recognize that identity formation or healing is often the slow, maybe painful process of existing in a state of definitionless flux. And that patience, that non-resigned patience, becomes the greatest therapeutic tool we have for navigating that flux successfully. So if individuals need to embrace ambiguity for their psychological health, leaders absolutely must master it for organizational survival today. In the corporate world, this really manifests as something called strategic ambiguity. We had that great example of manager Maria, who was leading her team through a really difficult tech merger.
Right. The environment she described was pure entre deux. Her team knew they were merged, technically.
Yeah.
But they had no idea about the new structure, who reported to whom, which projects would survive. Total uncertainty. And the traditional leader's impulse in that situation is often to, well, create a fake 5-point plan just to try and quell the anxiety, right?
Exactly. And that's usually a massive failure of what we call flexible leadership. The modern organizational environment just demands leaders who can actually thrive in strategic ambiguity. Maria understood that the absence of a complete, neat plan was the reality. Her real job wasn't to eliminate the uncertainty, because she couldn't, but to manage the collective anxiety around the in-between state. She didn't try to fake certainty. Instead, she offered total transparency about the information they did have, and, just as importantly, about the information they didn't have yet.
That small shift, just admitting the unknown, that feels huge. What else did she do to sort of hold the space for that uncertainty?
Well, she focused the team on controlling the one thing they could control: the integrity and the quality of their immediate present work. She created small, measurable, high-quality deliverables that were kind of insulated from the larger merger chaos. This gave the team a sense of localized efficacy, a feeling of momentum, even while the bigger picture was blurry. This is really embracing entre deux principles. It's fostering nuanced, micro-level decision-making, even when the macro-level strategy is still undefined. She built team resilience not by giving them a false answer, but by giving them an action plan for dealing with the uncertainty itself.
This ability to stay present, transparent, flexible, it seems like it requires a specific internal capacity. And this is where the idea of presence attentive comes in, right? Which is basically the psychological term for mindfulness in this context.
Precisely. Presence attentive is defined as the capacity to be aware of the environment and aware of oneself in the present moment. And crucially, receiving information with openness, without prejudice, and without reacting automatically based on old patterns. Think of it as a kind of deep, non-reactive listening skill, applied inwardly and outwardly. It allows a leader like Maria to register the distress of her team, to notice the lack of clarity from corporate, and to notice her own rising anxiety, all without immediately defaulting to some pre-programmed, often rigid response like blaming or shutting down or making false promises.
That idea of awareness without prejudice seems really key. We're constantly, almost instantaneously evaluating everything, aren't we? Is this a threat? Is it an opportunity based on our existing mental maps and past experiences?
Yes, exactly. And mindfulness, or presence attentive, is the process of consciously putting aside those cognitive veils, even just for a moment. It's the ability to receive information openly and not immediately judge a thought or situation based on the emotional impulse it triggers. Now, presence attentive functions both as a trait, meaning some people just have a higher natural predisposition towards it, and also as a state, which can fluctuate moment to moment based on how complex or stressful the situation is. A leader needs to be able to consciously tap into it as a state when, say, the big merger news hits the fan.
And the organizational impact of this, it goes way beyond just the leader's personal well-being, right? Studies are showing that when employees exhibit mindfulness, it's positively linked to things like job performance, work satisfaction, engagement. And really crucially for companies trying to retain talent during turbulent times, it's negatively linked to emotional exhaustion and the intention to quit. People are less likely to burn out and leave.
Absolutely. And the ripple effect flows directly from the top down. Research confirms that the leader's own capacity for presence attentive is positively linked to their employees' well-being and performance. It's contagious in a good way. But the question then becomes, how do we cultivate a leader who can actually maintain this kind of poise when everything's chaotic? We can look at its personality foundations. Studies link presence attentive positively to two specific traits from the Big Five personality model: conscientiousness and openness to experience.
Okay, let's dig into conscientiousness first. Because at first glance, that trait being orderly, responsible, reliable, it almost seems counterintuitive for embracing ambiguity. Wouldn't a highly conscientious person be the one who needs that 5-point plan?
That's the interesting subtlety we need to unpack. Yes, conscientiousness involves planning and order, but its deep connection to mindfulness comes through its strong association with high levels of auto-discipline and auto-regulation. The ability to form new habits, yes, but maybe more importantly, the capacity to consciously center and recenter your attention to meet your objectives, what we generally call self-discipline. That's absolutely essential for sustained mindfulness practice, whether it's formal meditation or just informal awareness during the day.
Okay, so it's not about being rigidly organized about the outcome necessarily, but about being disciplined and organized about the process of managing your own attention.
Exactly right. A highly conscientious leader has the self-regulatory muscle, if you will, to observe an emotionally challenging situation. Let's say a massive budget cut is announced, and to actively put aside the immediate reactive emotion, like anger or despair, and instead focus their attention on the present reality and what the necessary next steps are, calmly and deliberately. They exhibit reflective responses rather than impulsive ones. This disciplined capacity to recenter attention, to put aside distractions and focus on the immediate, productive, present moment, that shows a really significant positive correlation with presence attentive. It gives them the internal structure they need to handle external structural collapse.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's look at the other trait, openness to experience. That seems like a different kind of support system for mindfulness and handling the entre deux.
It is. Openness is characterized by things like curiosity, paying attention to feelings, both your own and others, intellectual curiosity, and just generally being receptive to new ideas and feedback. When a big change like a merger throws the old rulebook out the window, the leader has to be open to new, maybe unconventional solutions. They can't just rely on how we've always done things. This trait shares key characteristics like curiosity and receptivity directly with presence attentive. People who score high on openness tend to be less reliant on strictly defined historical ways of doing things. They're more tuned in, more receptive to the input from their shifting environment.
So they're more comfortable with the novelty of the situation itself. They might even view ambiguity less as a threat that needs to be squashed immediately and more like a complex puzzle to be examined, to be understood.
Precisely. They actively engage with the nuance of the entre deux. They're the ones who might consider merging two completely disparate systems in a way nobody thought of before because they're intellectually curious enough to actually sit in the tension of those conflicting mandates without freaking out. So this combination, the self-regulated discipline from conscientiousness and the intellectual receptivity from openness, provides this really robust, non-impulsive psychological foundation. It's what allows a leader like Maria to hold that difficult space for uncertainty and actually guide her team through strategic ambiguity effectively.
All right, let's shift fields completely now and look at the classroom, which seems like a place where we're traditionally trained to eliminate ambiguity as quickly as possible, right? Get the right answer, fill in the blank. But even there, maybe especially there, the most profound learning seems to happen in that threshold space.
We heard that great story about the philosophy seminar. The professor asked a really complex ethical question, and instead of immediately calling on someone for an answer, he just let the silence fall. Like a full, intentional minute of quiet. You could feel the students fidgeting, getting uncomfortable. That intentional silence the professor created, that was the entre deux of critical thought, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And that intentional discomfort is so pedagogically powerful. Education itself is undergoing this profound shift, moving away from the traditional teacher-centered lecture model towards things like project-based learning or PBL. PBL is really seen as a key innovation for cultivating those crucial 21st century skills: critical thinking, collaboration, problem solving.
And this shift to PDL involves what's called a double shift, right? It's not just about rearranging the desks or using more group work.
No, it's much deeper than that. The first shift is really philosophical, moving towards truly student-centered instruction, letting their questions drive the learning. The second shift is moving from just thinking about instruction, what the teacher delivers, to focusing on the actual process of learning what the student constructs. In traditional models, projects often came at the end, didn't they? Like proof that you absorbed the lecture content. But in PBL, the project or the complex problem comes first. It establishes the need to learn up front. It forces students to use inquiry, to problem solve, to try and decipher complex issues before all the content has been neatly delivered. That initial unsolved problem, that is the learning entre deux.
Okay, so if the student is grappling with a problem they don't quite have the tools for yet, the teacher's role becomes this constant balancing act, managing the tension between giving guidance and fostering autonomy.
Exactly. And that management happens along what's called the inquiry continuum. Teachers are constantly assessing, okay, how much control do I need to maintain here versus how much can I let go? At one end, you have teacher-directed inquiry. Here, the teacher might determine the main questions, maybe the methods the students will use. The goal is still guiding investigation and discovery, so it's student-centered in process, but the structure is largely teacher-led. This is really appropriate when students are just starting out, maybe lack foundational skills or background knowledge in that area.
And then at the other end of the spectrum, the other pole is student-directed inquiry.
Right. And here, students are autonomously choosing their own topics. They're formulating their own questions, selecting their own methods of investigation. The teacher's role shifts completely. They become more like a supportive facilitator, maybe a consultant, providing resources, scaffolding the process, offering feedback, but only when it's really needed or asked for. The teacher has to actively fight that impulse to just jump in and lecture or give the answer. Their job is more like being a responsive resource library and a mentor.
So the really skilled PBL teacher is basically operating daily in that liminal space between these two modes, constantly adjusting.
Constantly. They're always assessing the distance, you could say, between where the student currently is and the intended learning goal. If that gap is huge, the student probably needs more structure, more building. If the gap is smaller and the student is showing more initiative, they need more fostering of their independence. This dynamic adjustment back and forth along that continuum, that's really the heart of pedagogical expertise in this model. It's about tailoring the approach to push the student into their optimal learning zone, that productive struggle zone, the entre deux.
Let's dig into those two core roles a bit more. Building and fostering the entre deux. What does building actually look like in practice when that knowledge gap is pretty significant?
Okay, so when a student seems overwhelmed or maybe lacks direction, the teacher needs to engage in active building. This involves providing more structure, more guidance, but it's done critically. A classic technique is answering a student's direct question with another question, one that pushes them towards self-discovery instead of just giving them the answer. So if a student asks, what's the best source to use for this policy paper, the teacher might respond with something like, well, what criteria did you use to evaluate the trustworthiness of the last source we looked at together?
Ah, right. That immediately puts the cognitive load, the responsibility, back onto the student. It forces them into that slightly uncomfortable zone where they have to generate the answer or the method rather than just passively receive it.
Exactly. And this technique, when done well, achieves several things at once. First, it builds relevant learning because the student gains practical, self-generated experience. Second, it develops empowered students by affirming their ability to think for themselves, boosting their sense of efficacy, and encouraging them to share their thoughts. And third, very importantly, it helps cultivate a safe place for learning. It acknowledges that failure, or not knowing immediately, isn't some personal failing. It's just a normal part of the messy learning process.
Okay. And then, once that foundation is stronger, the teacher can shift more towards fostering as the student's autonomy increases.
Right. Fostering is really about supporting and stretching that growing independence. Here, teachers deliberately don't just spoon-feed content answers. Instead, they emphasize learning the skills needed for independent mastery, things like research methodologies, data analysis techniques, ethical reasoning frameworks. They provide realistic, often messy, industry-relevant materials or problems, things that force students to grapple with the kind of real-world ambiguity that rarely comes in a neat textbook package. Fostering helps students move confidently along that inquiry continuum towards becoming fully independent learners, making them fluent, you could say, in the language of the entre deux.
When you pull back and look at this, it's really clear how fundamental those classical learning theories are to this whole modern practice, isn't it? Piaget, Vygotsky, Brunner, they all seem to advocate for learning that was active, social, experiential, placing the real moment of learning right in that space of productive discomfort.
Absolutely. The constructivist theories all emphasize that true intellectual growth happens when the mind is active, when it's wrestling with something new. Think about Piaget's core process. A student encounters a new idea or experience that doesn't quite fit their existing mental map. This requires accommodation they have to adjust their existing cognitive structures, their schemas, or maybe they try to fit it into what they already know, which is assimilation. That period between recognizing the new information and successfully integrating it, that's a state of cognitive disequilibration.
That disequilibrium, that cognitive wobble, that feels like the philosophical entre deux, that electric space between the two poles, but happening inside the learner's head.
It is exactly that. It is the silence in the philosophy seminar. That silence isn't wasted time. It's an intense emotional and intellectual workshop, an atelier, where the student has to reconcile the conflict. They have to actively reshape their own worldview to achieve a new, more stable state of cognitive equilibration. And the depth of understanding that emerges from that self-directed struggle, from navigating that internal entre deux, it just surpasses passive knowledge acquisition every single time. It's the intelligence of the in-between, really, made manifest right there in the act of learning. #outro.
Wow. This deep dive has really shown us, I think, that the most uncomfortable spaces, those ambiguities, those silences, the in-betweens, they aren't voids to be avoided. They're actually where the greatest growth and resilience are cultivated. Whether we're managing a complex transition at work, or processing devastating grief and trying to figure out who we are now, or even just trying to deepen our critical thinking in a classroom, the lesson seems pretty clear. Resist the tyranny of the binary. Don't rush to the poles.
Yeah, we've seen that true health, true effectiveness often comes from cultivating a tolerance for that ambiguity, whether that's through the philosophical courage, just honestly frequent complexity, or through developing presence attentive or mindfulness to regulate our knee-jerk judgments, or even through designing learning experiences that intentionally allow inquiry and uncertainty to breathe. It's really about becoming an active participant in the fluid movement of life itself, rather than just waiting impatiently for the final, neat, and often, frankly, dishonest label. The threshold isn't just a hallway we're supposed to rush through to get somewhere else. It is the place. It's the truth happening right now.